Welcome everybody. This is the Zoom launch for Douglas Pretzel's collected Correspondence of Karl, Heinrich, Ulrichs. And my name is Dr. Liz Connor of the Department of Archaeology and History at La Trobe University, and I'll be chairing today's proceedings, which you can see here presented on the slide. And while you're looking over the slide, I also want to acknowledge that the Zoom is being projected from Indigenous country. I'm on the country of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nations, and I want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and also to note that their sovereignty was never ceded. So first, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Sean Brady, who lectures in modern British and Irish history at Birkbeck in the University of London. Sean is the author of 6 books on the history of sexuality and masculinity, and is a series editor, Genders and Sexualities in History, for the publisher Palgrave Macmillan.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sean Brady from Birkbeck College, University of London, and one of the series editors for Palgrave Macmillan's Genders and Sexualities in History series. Now today is the occasion for celebration of the launch of Douglas Pretzel's superb critical source edition of the Correspondence of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. And I'm delighted to be asked to say a few words about the significance of this new volume. The Correspondence of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, a critical edition, is a groundbreaking collection of letters and documentary sources. It brings together for the first time many of the surviving letters from and to Ulrichs. Also, much of his surviving correspondence has been translated into English for the first time for this volume. Ulrichs was a highly original and key mid to late 19th century German thinker in the development of modern ideas on sexuality and sexual difference, specifically homosexuality. Ulrichs is familiar to scholars of 19th century European sexualities thanks to increasing interest in historical homosexuality since the late 1970s. However, Ulrichs exists in scholarship as a rather shadowy figure, understood in parenthesis to and of influence upon thinkers in the emerging paradigm of sexology, such as Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Karl Westphal, Magnus Hirschfeld, Marc-André Raffalovich, John Addington Symonds, and Henry Havelock Ellis. But little more than this is analysed by scholars. The publication of this source edition reveals a significant lacuna in our understanding of the influence of Ulrichs in his time. As I said, Ulrichs was an original in many ways. Concepts such as sexual intermediacy and the odd-sounding 19th century neologism earnings, used to describe sexuality between men, were first conceptualized by Ulrichs and appear in the work of late 19th and early 20th century sexologists. In most scholarly analyses interested in sexology, Ulrichs has tended to exist as a footnote rather than the main focus of analysis, however. Ulrichs was a German lawyer and a jurist who single-handedly launched and maintained a literary campaign between the mid-1860s right up to the 1880s, advocating the rights of men who desired other men. Given the extent to which Ulrichs influenced thinkers in the next generation to him, it is remarkable, certainly in terms of the history of ideas, that his life, ideas and their contexts have not attracted the substantial historiographical attention that they might. The publication of this critical source edition of Ulrichs' correspondence illuminates a significant lacuna in our empirical knowledge of Ulrichs and his life, ideas and works. Douglas Pretzel's superbly edited critical source edition brings to the fore the significance of and also the legacy of Ulrichs' often idiosyncratic ideas on gender dissonance and same-sex desire. As I said, some of Ulrichs' ideas have been known to historians of sexuality for over half a century, but gleaned only from his published works. This critical source edition gives scholars new and unique insights into Ulrichs' intellectual world and networks of exchange through surviving correspondence. Much of Ulrichs' writings were destroyed either in his lifetime or since his death in 1895. This critical source edition brings together in translation the correspondence that does remain and is an invaluable contribution to scholarship. Douglas Pretzel's critical source edition is a wonderful addition to the Genders and Sexualities in History series with Palgrave Macmillan. It was thrilling for us as the series editors team to receive Douglas's proposal for the critical source edition, given the significance of Ulrichs to the history of sexuality, the history of gender, and the history of ideas. The Palgrave Macmillan series aims to accommodate and foster new approaches to historical research in the fields of genders and sexualities. Now, while the list of monograph titles in the series now is extensive, the series editors and history publishers have from its outset emphasized the need to promote the publication of scholarly edited collections and critical source editions, especially in these fields where primary evidence is scattered and obscured in archives around the world, or accessible only to scholars who can read the languages in which they were written. In other words, access to empirical sources in these fields has tended to be the preserve of the expert scholar with privileged access to archives. The publication of critical source editions with the series, and especially their availability through an online platform, means that rare primary evidence exists in highly accessible forms and in English for use in scholarship and in teaching. The Correspondence of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, a critical edition, is the most recent critical publication source with the series and resonates with other critical source editions with the series, such as Philip Healy and Frederick Rodin's translated edition of Rafalovich's Uranianism and Unisexuality from 2016, Amber Regis's The Memoirs of John Addington Symonds from 2017, Sean Brady's John Addington Symonds and Homosexuality in 2012, Brian Lewis's Wolfenden's Witnesses in 2016, and Samantha Caslin and Julia Late's forthcoming source edition, Wolfenden's Women, Prostitution in Post-War Britain. In common with all volumes in the Genders and Sexuality in History series, the Correspondence of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, a critical edition, is a multifaceted and meticulously researched scholarly study. It is an exciting contribution to our understanding of gender and sexuality in the past. It brings empirical evidence to the fore and is a key contribution, therefore, to the expansion of our knowledge of Ulrichs and his context and influences. Dr. Pretzel and the volume's translator, Michael Lombardi-Nash, are to be congratulated on the significant intellectual achievement of the publication of this exciting critical source edition, which should be valued by scholars for years to come.
Thank you, Sean. Next, we will have readings from the book introduced by Douglas Pretzel and read by David Chandler. Douglas is the author of this book, and I'm co-supervising his PhD with Dr. Timothy Jones at La Trobe University. And David is an actor and creative arts student at Federation University, Ballarat.
In the book, 227 letters spanning the years 1846 to 1894 are structured in 3 sections that roughly approximate the years before Ulrichs began writing his books, his main years of activism, and the final years leading up to his exile in Italy. We have made selections from each of the 3 sections. The first of these is a letter that Ulrichs sent to his sister, Ulrica, on the 22nd of September, 1862, letter 80 in the book. Ulrica may have been the first person Ulrichs had fully opened up to about his sexuality, probably in June 1862. Ulrich's family was close and affectionate, but also deeply religious. Ulrich's grandfather, uncle, and both of his brother-in-laws were all Protestant ministers. This letter is Ulrich's response to her replies, which may have included religious overtones. Ulrichs invented a new terminology for sexuality, and in this letter he used a prototype, uranier, to describe men attracted to other men.
Dear sister, finally I have found time to reply to your letters of 13th and 20th June this year, and thank you very much for your kind and deep concern about my interests in Borgdorf. But let's put those things aside and discuss the other matter today. I did not write previously because I was so overwhelmed with work, and it was impossible to write you even a short letter regarding this matter. I received your second letter along with calendar notices which I had overlooked while I was attending the shooting festival, which kept me busy from morning to night as I had to file newspaper reports about the event. On my return, I received very important urgent work from my boss, and finally I have been constantly engaged in some work as a favour to Tivers in Achim, namely the manuscript for a pre-publication legal work of his, editing a very boring, painful and long book. Since the manuscript was already at the printers, he has required me to work incessantly. That is also why I did not send you birthday greetings, though my dearest wishes go to you nonetheless. I just did not care to write a short letter of best wishes. Now, down to business. Dear sister, the tone in which you wrote your last letters was, if anything on this earth could have had more of an effect, more effective than all your earlier bitterness. By writing in such a loving tone, you have removed the thorns from my heart and have thus succeeded. At your request, I assure you that I will not circulate your letter. Well, I admit to the inception of a free and easy feeling because you have written or have partly thought that Karl is right. However, the rest, my dear sister, is based on false assumptions. Lovingly, you admonish me to make the decision now to change. Then you admit that the change will be difficult, but God will help. God has given me love in the same orientation to that which he gave to women, i.e. directed at men. To ask God now to change this orientation would be in the highest degree unchristian. Who may ask God to perform a miracle? Thou shalt not test God. Who may ask God to destroy his own creation, which is yet made for a purpose yet unexplored? Do you profess to know the poor creature of man better than the Creator? Dear sister, if you and the rest of you continue to not listen to the strongest reasons and assurances, then in the end I really must not only suspect your prejudice, but also your unwillingness to honor the truth because it does not fit into your current world view. The truth should therefore be distorted to fit your sophisticated perspective. Should that be pleasing to God? You now think in Berlin an unfortunate verse would have brought me to this idea. First of all, I do not know what verse, and really want to hear from you which one you mean. This assumption that my inclination was caused by an idea is entirely mistaken. Likewise, you exclaim without any reason, "Oh, you should never have gone to Berlin." For sure, Berlin seems to me to be a headquarters of the Uranias, but you are very much mistaken if you think that this inclination arose in Berlin. It arose, as I said, exactly at the onset of puberty, when I was still a student.
Ulrichs described a new identity for same-sex attracted men, who he called Earnings, and wrote 12 short books describing his ideas. When Ulrichs started writing, he began receiving letters from men who found themselves reflected in what he wrote. These letters came from all over the German states, Austria, Hungary, Switzerland, and even Russia, France and England. Some letters came from men integrally involved in the subcultures of the big cities. Others wrote movingly of their isolation and the effects of the letters had on them, and many of them included sexual autobiographies. The following are a selection of passages from letters sent to Ulrichs between 1864 and 1869. The first, from an unnamed Earning on 23rd May 1864.
Dear Sir, as a fellow sufferer whose bitter experiences have changed into a rich life, I would like to thank you for your book. You have been brave to raise the issue in public, where little understanding exists. But perhaps yours is only an initial attempt to begin a discussion of the subject. Since the whole thing has come this far, I do not doubt we will be successful. Now we have several active and talented persons on our side, people who are educated and are good writers. I have decided to take an active part in the battle that you have begun.
An Austrian soldier in Leipzig, 20th December 1864.
You have boldly broken open the closets, even at the neglect of your social interests. I am deeply shaken by such daring, and my interest is doubled, because I find again my own self in much of your writing.
An earning in Potsdam, 2nd of October, 1867.
Yesterday evening, your report from Munich, dated August 31 and September 3, reached me from Koblenz. Thank you 1,000 times for your valiant fight. All those whose fate it concerns right up to the present generation will have you to thank for bringing the matter forcefully into public debate. It will bear good fruit. How you must have felt. When I read through your report, I was so seized by it that it remained in my mind for hours. Even now my heart is throbbing.
A 29-year-old earning in Saxony, 18th October, 1867.
I am the fortunate husband of a wife who loves me passionately, and father of a charming 3-year-old girl. What I feel for her is friendship. The relationship, not the urgency of passion, brought about the marriage. On the other hand, the sight of a handsome young man does arouse my passion, which is truly of the sexual kind.
A 28-year-old in Vienna, 6th November, 1867.
Now and then, fantastic shapes appear when our earnings smarten up their disagreeable men's clothing with a woman's taste and then wear them for show. Not a few examples of this kind exist in Vienna. The Countess, for example, wears shoes with gold fringes. The governess wears coats of velvet, very unusual cuts, half a woman's cloak, ornamented with all kinds of poetic garlands.
Finally, the last passage comes from 2 letters sent to the former soldier and budding novelist Karl Robert Eggers in December 1873 and January 1874. In these letters, Ulrichs alludes to masculine earnings as Männlings and feminine earnings as Weiblings. He also recounts, without naming him, the difficult relationship he had with the other sexual pioneer, Karl Maria Kirkbenny, the man who coined the words homosexual and heterosexual in a letter to Ulrichs of 1868. These letters are 200 and 202 in my book.
I am looking forward to you writing about your own nature, in particular whether you are really a manling. There are also sham manlings who are not addressed in my booklets yet, because I learned about them only recently. In the booklets of Index and Inclusia, I was still one-sided. I knew only Weiblings, believing myself to be a Weibling, as I did not know of graduations. I'm surprised you find it so difficult in Berlin. I studied there for 2 semesters and found the opposite. That is to say, only with Dionings and not Earnings. Unfortunately, the magazine Uranius was not published due to a lack of subscribers. But how did you hear about that? Some of my comrades have already made considerable efforts to criticize and fault my booklets. They called the contents of Memnon nothing but can, the contents of all my booklets sophistery, the poems miserable, and said that all my works had only harmed our cause, and that anyone can write something like that, etc. I jokingly call the faction the party of grumblers, the grumbler party, without now betraying myself as the subject of that grumbling. There really is a race of its own among us, in more than one sense, even in other orientations. One of the main grumblers is probably motivated by unconscious jealousy. He writes quite well, has a more rhetorical and flourishing style than I do, is also a poet, but has never had anything printed, of course. He would like to publish for our cause, which, please note, in particular, I most earnestly wish he would do. I mean that he might, but does not seem to be able to get his manuscript ready for printing at all. He doesn't seem to be able to forgive me that it wasn't he, but I who presented first. For all the world's sake, of course, he will never admit this. He may also not be quite clear about this himself. Incidentally, I am on a very friendly footing with him. He also pays me an annual Numa penny. He would help me, and certainly help others, wherever and however he could.
Thanks to both Douglas and David for these remarkable readings. Next, we have a few words from Michael Lombardi-Nash, who worked with Douglas on the translation of the letters. Michael made the first published translation of Ulrichs' 12 booklets in 1994, and so was the scholar of German best placed to work with Douglas on this project. After Michael, Douglas will say a few more words about the book.
Well, first I'd like to thank Douglas for the kind words in his book. Paul Nash got me started translating about 40 years ago. I'd found a book by Ulrichs, and Paul said, translate the thing and I'll read it. Meanwhile, historians had lamented the lack of translations, especially from German. They said that Ulrichs was important and that translations would have given impetus to better studies. And in fact, Douglas, independent of me, in his honors thesis, remarked that there had been substantial improvement in the thoroughness and accuracy in Ulrichs' scholarship since the translations. So I feel my work was successful, and I was delighted when Douglas asked me to collaborate in this work.
Thank you, Michael. I first encountered Ulrichs on the 1st of May 2008 in Munich. I was living there at the time, and this was the day after I first met my husband, Peter. On that day, I was attending a ceremony for the placing of a gay maypole in Karl Heinrich Ulrichs' flats. Afterwards, I Googled Ulrichs, and so began my interest in reading about him that finally culminated in me enrolling 10 years later to do a PhD at La Trobe University, Melbourne in 2018. As part of this research, I collected several hundred letters from 16 archives in Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Austria, and Hungary, and sourced other letters from published sources. With the help of transcriber Rolf Thalmann and translator Michael Lombardi-Nash, who's just spoken, the letters comprised the research database of primary sources for my thesis. Palgrave Macmillan agreed to publish a selection of these, most of the letters to and from Ulrichs, in the critical edition that we're launching today. I would like to thank Rolf and Michael and my supervisors Tim Jones and Liz Connor, my husband Peter, as well as 3 friends, Darryl Scott Lindsay, Edward Hollis, and Amy Samuels Means, who encouraged me to write on Ulrichs. Thanks go to David Chandler, an actor and creative arts student with an interest in Ulrichs, who delivered today's readings. And I would also like to thank Sean Brady, who initially suggested I submit a published proposal, and the team at Palgrave Macmillan for all the support during the writing process. Finally, this book is dedicated to my mother, Marjorie Mary Pretzel. I was staying with her this time last year while writing the introduction to my book, when she suffered a catastrophic stroke from which she never recovered. I miss her very much, but know that if she were alive, she would be participating in this launch.
Thank you, Michael and Douglas, and thank you also to Dr. Sean Brady and David Chandler. We hope that all watching enjoyed this Zoom book launch and that you are interested enough to either buy the book or recommend that your library purchases it. Thank you and goodbye.